for the dangers and realities. I think our committee has been most fortunate to be able to put together the speakers that we have, and we thank you for coming and participating. Before introducing today's program, it is important that I announce to you once again that for you who do not have a program with you, that the panel, the response panel to today's speaker will be today at 1 o'clock in the Bonner Room of the Student Union. Following that 1.5-hour panel discussion, we will have a movie again today at 2:30. We hope you will participate in all the activities as they are so twined together to make the week a meaningful one. I have a very special privilege today, and that privilege is to introduce a good friend of mine, a person who's been known for education in Montana and Idaho for many years. Wherever she goes, her first civic duty is to become involved in education. And she spends many hours doing that, and I have to say to you, while I have her in my presence, that when it gets rough and discouraging, she always calls and says, keep up the good work and do other things. We affectionately call her Bev. She will introduce our speaker today, the Vice Chairman of the Board of Trustees, Beverly Bemis.
Thank you, Tony. You and your committee are to be congratulated for having successfully put together an exciting week of speakers and activities on this very vital subject, nuclear war, the dangers and realities. Our speaker today, David Sullivan, is Legislative Assistant for Budget, Defense, and Foreign Affairs for Senator Sims, and is Senator McClure's Legislative Assistant for Defense Appropriation Subcommittees. He has accomplished so much in his young, active life that it's difficult to detail or apprise you of the range of his experiences. In addition to his many achievements listed in your brochure, he has published widely on international and military affairs, including a number of articles identifying the Soviet Union deceptions on SALT I and SALT II. He has been described as a brilliant CIA Soviet analyst by Roland Evans and Robert Novak. He even has the distinction of being attacked 5 times by name in the Soviet press as an enemy of détente. We are delighted that Major Sullivan is able to be with us, and it is my pleasure to introduce him to you. Major Sullivan.
Thank you all very much. It's a very great honor and privilege and pleasure to be here at this fine campus you all have at North Idaho College. And I take great pleasure in being able to address you all on this very serious and sobering subject of nuclear war. At the outset of my remarks, I would like to say that people on both sides of this question of how to prevent nuclear war agree on the fundamental objective that we have to prevent nuclear war. There's no one in this world, I would say, both Russian and American, who seriously desires nuclear war. We are all living together on this planet, and we have to continue to live together on this small planet, and no one wants nuclear war. And I think we can all agree that that objective is a very fundamental objective that we share. The disagreement stems from how best to go about achieving the prevention of nuclear war. And I'm going to give you one set of views in my remarks this morning about how the strategic balance is today. I'm going to give you a little bit about the Reagan strategic programs, a little bit about the Soviet strategic programs, and then I'll talk a little about nuclear weapons freeze and START, the strategic arms reduction talks, and the intermediate range nuclear force talks going on in Geneva. And then, if I have time, I will give you a little bit about Soviet SALT violations, which are becoming increasingly an important issue. New York Times on Thursday of last week had a front-page article with this headline, "Panel tells Reagan the Russians seem to have broken arms pacts." I'll get into that a little bit in my remarks. So basically what I'd like to start out with is a discussion of the strategic balance on the two sides, Could I have my first slide, please? I've got some slides and I've got some. The military balance between the Soviet Union and the United States shifted in the view of Soviet strategic experts and military writers and ideologues in about 1971. Since 1971, increasingly in the Soviet ideological and military literature, you find references to the shift in the correlation of forces in favor of the Soviet Union. The correlation of forces in Soviet terminology includes both the military balance and also political, economic, psychological, and even social factors. In the view of Soviet military leaders, Soviet political leaders, and Soviet party leaders, ideologues, the correlation of forces has shifted in favor of the Soviet Union and against the United States since 1971. This chart kind of sums it all up in about three main points. The Soviets have strategic intercontinental superiority over the United States in both offensive and defensive capabilities, in both qualitative and quantitative capabilities. I'll show you some examples of this as we progress. Theater nuclear capabilities, that's intermediate range nuclear forces in Europe. Soviets have an overwhelming advantage, and they also have an overwhelming advantage in Northeast Asia against the People's Republic of China and Japan. In naval forces, the Soviets have a growing advantage, although their superiority is not as great there as in the other areas. And in conventional general-purpose ground forces, the Soviets have a huge advantage since 1945, the end of World War II. Here's an illustration of Soviet strategic superiority in the present. I haven't brought this chart up to date. It says 1982. There are only minor changes since 1982. Can you see the chart? Are the numbers readable? I won't spend too much time on them if they're not. What this shows is that Soviets have about 1,000 more intercontinental warheads than the United States. They have about 400 more ICBM launchers, not missiles. They have thousands of extra missiles. They have about 600 more submarine-launched ballistic missiles than the United States, and they have about 150 more bombers than the United States. Now, this chart includes in Soviet forces the backfire bomber and takes out of American forces those forces that the Reagan administration is deactivating unilaterally. I'll come to that point in a little while. In defensive capabilities, strategic defenses, the Soviets have an ABM system around Moscow, which they have deactivated half of, but they're modernizing, and they're going to bring it back up to its allowed 64 launcher level and maybe beyond. They're going to go all the way up to at least 100, which is the level allowed in the SALT I ABM treaty. In SAM missiles, they have 10,000 SAM sites deployed around the Soviet Union, and we have 0 surface-to-air missiles for air defense. They have about 5,000 air defense interceptor aircraft, and we have about 100 to 300, all of which are in the Air National Guard or Air Force Reserve. In attack submarines, those are submarines that go out, hunter-killer submarines, and try to attack ballistic missile submarines, any submarine warfare submarines, attack submarines. Soviets have about 189, we have about 81. They have over twice as many as we do. In civil defenses, the Soviets have a very sophisticated nationwide program of civil defenses. It won't protect everyone, and it won't save their whole society from the holocaust of nuclear war by any means, but they do have a very sophisticated program that's nationwide and which is much bigger than ours. It's 4 to 5 times bigger in yearly funding, at least, than ours. We have a very limited civil defense program. What is the underlying purpose of this Soviet military structure that has been building for the last 20 years and has just over the last 10 years achieved overwhelming military superiority over the United States? Well, the Soviets don't build missiles and rockets and bombers and bombs for no purpose. They have a very serious purpose behind all of this. Their foreign policy objectives, as derived from their doctrinal and ideological writings, can be summarized in those following 4 points that are extracted from that enormous body of Soviet writings. They strive for strategic checkmate. The purpose of their strategic nuclear superiority is to paralyze the United States to subject us to strategic nuclear blackmail, thereby opening the way for wars of national liberation, as is going on today in El Salvador, other parts of Central America, and other parts of Africa. And also to open the way for conventional aggression by either proxies of the Soviet Union, as in Southeast Asia, Kampuchea, and Laos, the Vietnamese proxies, or in Angola using the Cuban proxies, or in Afghanistan where Soviet forces themselves are engaged suppressing the Afghan nationalist freedom fighters. Those are the purposes of the Soviet foreign policy that underlies their military buildup. Now I'm going to run through this one very quickly because I want to come back to it toward the end of my talk in somewhat more detail. These are the 7 most significant Soviet violations of the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement, SALT I and SALT II, and other arms control agreements. So I'll go through them very quickly. The SS-19 heavy ICBM that replaced the light SS-11 ICBM in violation of Article 2 of the SALT I Interim Agreement. That is a very significant Soviet violation, allowing them to quintuple their missile counterforce capability over the 5 years of the SALT I Agreement between 1972 and 1977. Number 2, stockpiled ICBMs for rapid refire. Yesterday, Senator McClure in Washington gave a press conference that focused upon that subject. We have some of the press clippings today from that press conference. We also have available to you in Senator McClure's office here in Coeur d'Alene the statement he made on that problem yesterday in Washington. That also allows the Soviets to increase their counterforce missile capability enormously. The stockpiled extra launchers, extra missiles they have above and beyond the number of launchers they're limited to in SALT II. Number 3, high-yield underground nuclear weapons tests. Senator McClure a week ago gave a press conference focusing upon Soviet violations there. We have 95% confidence that the Soviets have tested 15 times underground nuclear weapons above the 150 kiloton threshold of the Threshold Test Ban Treaty. ABM mode tests. Senator Sims has focused upon this. There was an editorial yesterday in the Wall Street Journal about a Senator Sims letter to the President, about 3 weeks old, pointing out Soviet violations of the SALT I ABM Treaty by testing SAM-5, SAM-10, and SAM-12 surface-to-air missiles in an ABM mode, which is prohibited by the SALT I ABM Treaty. ABM battle management radars, number 5, that too was in the Senator Sims letter. The Soviets are constructing huge radars around the periphery of the Soviet Union that have a battle management capability in violation of Article I of the ABM Treaty, which says that the Soviets are not allowed to develop a nationwide ABM defense or even the base for a nationwide ABM would provide. Tested in the ABM. Number 6, biological and chemical warfare in Southeast Asia, Kampuchea, and Laos, and in Afghanistan, Southwest Asia. The Soviets are using so-called yellow rain. That's biological warfare and chemical warfare in violation of 2 international agreements, the Chemical Warfare Protocol of Geneva, 1925, and the Biological Warfare Convention signed in 1972 and ratified in 1975. There's conclusive evidence of this Soviet activity, and the President himself has spoken out on this at least twice. Number 7 is the Soviet activity in Cuba, which the President will be addressing the nation on in a joint session of Congress tomorrow night. I think he will probably mention some of the Soviet military activity going on in Cuba today in violation of the 1962 Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement, which ended the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, the year that the world came closer to nuclear war than it's ever been before. This is some of the activity going on in Cuba. I'll come back to that at the end in more detail. Soviets, however, last year in 1982 shipped 3 times as much military equipment to Cuba as in any one year since 1962, the year of the crisis. Now, I mentioned that my chart of the strategic balance showed U.S. forces inferior to Soviet forces, because I've taken out of U.S. forces those forces that the Reagan administration is deactivating unilaterally. Let me give you a little background. Under the Carter administration, every one of our strategic programs was either cut back in funding and number of deployment, delayed, or canceled altogether. The rate of our nuclear weapons testing underground under the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, 1976, was lowest that it had ever been under the Carter administration. It went down to almost nothing. And indeed, the Carter administration deactivated 500 nuclear warheads from our forces. So our strategic forces reached the lowest level that they have ever had in years under the Carter administration. Now, the Reagan administration, after campaigning upon the premise that there was a window of vulnerability to our forces, that the Soviets were ahead of us, they had superiority, the Reagan administration has continued this unilateral deactivation of our forces that began under the Carter administration, and in fact you can trace all the way back to the late 1960s. The Reagan administration is unilaterally deactivating over 292 nuclear missiles and bombers carrying over 500 nuclear warheads. This force of 292 delivery vehicles and 500 warheads comprises 14% of the delivery vehicles were allowed under SALT II, and over 33% of the firepower or megatonnage of our forces. 1/3 of our strategic capability is being unilaterally deactivated by the Reagan administration. That's composed of 160 Polaris SLBM missiles, 80 B-52D intercontinental bombers, and 54 Titan II intercontinental ballistic missiles. Altogether, 292 launchers and bombers carrying over 500 warheads, 33% of our force. We haven't even asked the Soviets for a quid pro quo in arms control negotiations in Geneva, the START negotiations, which are premised upon achieving reductions in forces and in warheads in particular. So it would be rather safe to say that our arms control negotiating posture is badly coordinated with our strategic posture, and the two are just not in sync. We are unilaterally doing what we're asking the Soviets to agree to do. Soviets have no incentive to do anything more than just simply watch us deactivate our own forces unilaterally. In addition to deactivating 1/3 of our firepower of existing forces, the Reagan administration is behaving as if a nuclear weapons freeze resolution has already passed the Congress. Tomorrow, the House of Representatives is supposed to vote finally on the nuclear weapons freeze resolution as amended. It's taken several weeks and several iterations of debate. But tomorrow is the final, I think, debate and vote on the nuclear weapons freeze in the House. And as I say, the Reagan administration is behaving as if that resolution has already not only passed the House, but also passed the Senate, because the Reagan administration is planning to stop production and deployment of the only two strategic programs that we have today that are being deployed. And I'm speaking now of the Trident I SLBM, that is the submarine-launched ballistic missile, and the air-launched cruise missile B. Both of these programs are the only two programs that we have underway today that are being deployed today under the Reagan administration. And in the defense budget submitted to the Congress in January as part of the overall Reagan budget, both of these programs are being canceled. So the Reagan administration, after deactivating this enormous 1/3 of our capability existing, is also cutting back on our future programs, our present programs that are in deployment and production today. That's what this slide illustrates. In addition, there are many other things that the Reagan administration has done to our strategic forces that are the complete opposite of the platform pledging a strategic and military buildup. For example, the MX program has been cut from the 200 that the Carter administration planned down to 0, now back up to 100. They may not even get the 100. Next week, the Senate Appropriations Committee will be considering the recent Scowcroft Commission report recommending the deployment of 100 MX missiles in existing Minuteman silos. So already the Reagan administration is at half the MX deployment level that the Carter administration planned, as bad as the Carter administration's strategic posture was. There are other examples, many others, I won't bore you with the long litany. I've hit the high points on those. Okay, this is a chart that shows the missiles in the strategic balance. You notice the Titan here, that's being taken out of our force unilaterally. There are 54 of those. Those are going to be gone. This is the Minuteman II, this is the Minuteman III, and this is the MX. Soviets have been building up their strategic forces in the 1970s, despite the SALT I and SALT II agreements, in an enormous scale. And you see at the end there the MX missile. Now these two missiles I want to talk about, rather this one and this one, I want to talk about in some detail as we progress, because that's what all the debate is about in Washington, whether or not those two new Soviet missiles, the Plesetsk IV, the PL-4, and the Plesetsk V, the PL-5, violate the SALT II treaty in an essential way. I'll come back to that at the end. This is another way to illustrate differences in the U.S. and the Soviet strategic forces over time. This is spending. I've showed you the numbers. This is spending. U.S. strategic forces spending, Soviet at the top. There's a gap of $229 billion or so over the last decade between the U.S. strategic forces spending and the Soviets. Now, a caveat. Everybody thinks that this enormous arms race they talk about is costing everybody enormous amounts of money. In fact, if you look at percentages of gross national product comparatively between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the Soviets are spending 15 to 20% of a smaller gross national product on defense. The United States is spending 6% of our much larger gross national product on defense. And in aggregate defense spending, we're significantly below the Soviets, $50 billion a year approximately. And further, most U.S. defense spending, about 3/4 of U.S. defense spending, goes for naval and general purpose forces rather than strategic forces. Strategic forces over the last 20 years have averaged less than 15% of our defense budget. Now, even if you add on the supporting costs for strategic forces, such as the warheads, their production and their maintenance, and command and control and logistics, the most that our strategic forces cost us is 25% of our defense budget, 1/4 of our defense budget. Even if the Reagan administration can achieve its strategic force plans, such as the Trident submarine, the air-launched cruise missile, the B-1B bomber, and the MX in the late 1980s, even if these programs do come to fruition and deployment, the maximum we'll be spending on our strategic forces will be 25% of our defense budget. Now, strategic forces, therefore, are the most economical forces that you can buy. They are the cheapest to procure. They are the cheapest to maintain. That's a fact. And they have the additional virtue of helping deter all levels of violence, conventional wars as well as nuclear wars. Strategic deterrence has worked over the last 38 years. This is another way to look at the strategic balance. I won't bore you with those numbers. This is, again, total numbers of strategic missiles and bombers. The Soviets on the right have 2,704 strategic missiles and bombers that are accountable in SALT II. The U.S. has 1,944. That does not show all of the forces that are being deactivated on the U.S. side. This is the so-called strategic nuclear arms race. This is the number of systems, I won't go through all of these, on the Soviet side from 1962 to 1982, and the triangles represent first deployment, initial operational capability. And this is on the U.S. side in the same time frame. And you notice that we have far fewer systems that we have deployed over the last 20 years in strategic programs. The Soviets, enormous number more. There's another way to look at that. In this term here, these symbols represent the programs in a little bit better graphical form, and you can see this is the Soviet strategic buildup, about 8 different kinds of missiles, of intercontinental ballistic missiles alone, compared to 3 for the U.S., one of which is not yet deployed. So the strategic nuclear arms race really is not a race at all. Over the last decade, the United States has unilaterally deactivated 710 delivery vehicles carrying over 6,000 warheads. At the same time, the Soviets have added over 1,000 new missile launchers. And 6,000 new warheads themselves. They've been deploying new warheads at a rate of 1,000 a year since 1974. We have been building down. There's another way to look at Soviet strategic capabilities and superiority. They have in the red here, anything in the red is a Soviet advantage. The one remaining advantage that people say we have is the number of warheads, and that has slipped away. The Soviets have about 1,000 more warheads than we do. They have more accurate warheads as well. This is an illustration of the previous point I made. National defense spending and the level of strategic forces within our defense spending. I said no more than a quarter of our defense spending can be attributed to strategic programs. That's what that chart shows. Well, this is a very important chart when thinking about the nuclear weapons freeze. What this chart shows is that 3/4 of all Soviet missiles and bombers are less than 5 years old. 3/4 of all American missiles and bombers are over 15 years old. If we have a nuclear weapons freeze passed by the House and the Senate, we will not be able to modernize our forces. The Soviets have already modernized their forces. Not only do they have numerical advantages, but their forces are more modern and have qualitative as well as quantitative superiority. That's what this chart shows. There are 5 main reasons why senators and representatives are opposed to the nuclear weapons freeze. Actually, there are 6. Number 1, the nuclear weapons freeze is contrary to the law of the land on U.S. arms control objectives. Law of the land on U.S. arms control objectives is the so-called Jackson Amendment to SALT I, passed in 1972 when the Congress acted upon the SALT I treaty and executive agreement. The Jackson Amendment said that in any future agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States on offensive forces, there should be equal levels of intercontinental forces, equal levels. Now, SALT II presumed to have equal levels. There were, in fact, equal ceilings in SALT II. However, there were important exceptions to those ceilings, such as the backfire bomber and Soviet monopoly on heavy ICBMs that allowed the Soviets to circumvent SALT II. The freeze, however, is directly the opposite of the Jackson Amendment, the law of the land on U.S. arms control objectives. Because of the disparities that I've illustrated to you, because of the Soviet superiority, if we were to agree to a freeze today, we would be changing the law of the land on U.S. arms control objectives. That is, we would be freezing the United States into permanent strategic inferiority to the Soviet Union. Now, we can change the laws in the Congress. That's what the Congress is for. But just keep in mind that in order to agree to a freeze, you have to invalidate the Jackson Amendment. That's the first reason people are against the freeze. The second main reason is the fact that it would, in fact, codify American strategic superiority. Number 3, it would prevent the United States from modernizing its strategic forces, which we need to do, obviously, when 3/4 of our forces are 15 years or older, and 3/4 of Soviet forces are 5 years old or newer. So we wouldn't be able to deploy the MX, the B-1, the Trident submarine, or the air-launched cruise missile, even though it's been canceled. We wouldn't be able to deploy the Pershing II in Europe and the ground-launched cruise missile in Europe. That's another problem that I'll come to later. That's the third reason. Our modernization program would be blocked by a nuclear weapons freeze. Number 4, Soviet incentives to negotiate in the START negotiations in Geneva and the intermediate range nuclear force negotiations in Geneva would be enormously reduced if a freeze was agreed to by the United States. The Soviets would have no reason to continue negotiating arms control with us if we were going to freeze our inferiority and allow them superiority. That would be fine with them, and they would have no incentive whatsoever to agree upon reductions in their forces, especially when they could watch us not only freeze our forces, but reduce them unilaterally ourselves. Number 4, a freeze would not be verifiable. The terms and provisions have yet to be spelled out in any precision, even with the SALT II treaty, which had an enormous complexity in detailed provisions. There are verification problems that are insurmountable. With a nuclear weapons freeze, we have no provisions to verify. You have no cooperative measures for verification enhancement. It would be a nightmare to verify a nuclear weapons freeze, believe me. And number 6, the 6th reason that we're against the nuclear weapons freeze is, as I mentioned, the Jackson Amendment. It's contrary to the Jackson Amendment. This final slide shows the decline in the number of U.S. weapons over time since the early 1960s. This is the number of U.S. strategic nuclear warheads over time. Not only have their numbers declined while Soviet numbers have risen, but their firepower, their explosive power, has also declined, and the control of those weapons has increased. So the United States, by modernizing its forces, which we need to do, will actually be reducing the lethality of those forces and increasing the command and control capability of those forces. We've reduced the number of warheads, and each warhead is on the average much smaller now than in the early 1960s. Those are the positive virtues of modernization of our strategic forces. That's what we're paying the money for in our new programs. More control, smaller yield, and fewer numbers. Now, you've all seen the New York Times report from last summer about how we're going to be building 17,000 new warheads under the Reagan administration's plan during the decade of the 1980s. What that article fails to point out, however, is that most of those 17,000 new warheads that will be fabricated if everything goes through Congress in this decade will not be additive to our forces at all. They will be reprocessed warheads. Only a very small number in the several thousands, a couple of thousands, are actually going to be additive to those we have today. So there's not a buildup of 17,000 warheads that is a net addition to what we already have that's being planned, only the reprocessing. Now, I mentioned the intermediate range nuclear force discussions in Geneva. This shows where we are. The Soviets have a 600-0 advantage over the United States in theater nuclear force capabilities. They have SS-4s, SS-5s, and SS-20s, all of which have long range, capable of reaching all parts of Western Europe, and we have 0 weapons in Europe that have similar capabilities, range and lethality enough to reach the Soviet Union. So they have a 600-0 advantage. The second chart here, second and third chart will show that in a slightly different way. Until 1977, this was the SS-4s and the SS-5s in the Soviet Union. In 1982, after they've added 351 SS-20s, this is how they have, this is their capability, and we have 0. So that's what we're up against in the INF talks in Geneva. President Reagan's position was 0-0. That is, we will not deploy any to match this part that the Soviets have. We will not deploy any Pershings or ground-launched cruise missiles if they will take away the 600 that they have to the 0 that we have, the so-called 0-0 option. The Soviets rejected it, of course, and now the President has proposed a fallback that we have a certain number and they have a certain equal number, which will require them to reduce and require us not to deploy as many. Soviets have rejected that also. In the START negotiations, this is our basic posture. This is a Soviet capability now, which I've already illustrated in another slide, to the U.S. This is the inferiority I'm talking about. The freeze would codify. Our START proposal says let's both sides reduce to an equal number of missiles. It would be 850 on both sides, carrying an equal number of warheads. That would be 5,000 warheads on each side. You could compose your force any way you like. You have freedom to mix. But you'd have equal numbers of missiles and warheads on the two sides. Well, the Soviets have rejected that, but it's still under discussion in Geneva. Now, I want to stop here and go to the SALT violations and arms control compliance question. As Eugene Rostow testified to Congress, Eugene Rostow is a former director of the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. In 1981, he said that arms control agreements do not serve world peace if we do not have confidence that the Soviets are complying. the Achilles heel, the crux of arms control, is verification. Everyone thinks in verification that we're concerned only about intelligence collection and finding evidence of Soviet cheating, analyzing that evidence, and that everyone assumes that once you have evidence of Soviet cheating, it's axiomatic, it's automatic that we will accuse the Soviets either privately, in diplomatic channels, or publicly of their violation, and their violations will stop, and they will come back into compliance with the agreement, with the treaty. The most difficult part of verification is the second part. The first part is the collection of the intelligence evidence, the analysis of it, and reaching a judgment about what the Soviets are doing. That is comparatively easy, despite enormous obstacles such as Soviet camouflage and concealment and deception, which I'll go into later. That's comparatively easy. The most difficult problem in verification is the second problem, making the political decision to actually do something about your evidence of Soviet cheating, to challenge the Soviets either publicly or privately and try and get them to come back into compliance with the agreement. That's called enforcement of compliance of an arms control agreement. Now, the ultimate sanction in international politics is force. If you really are mad enough about a Soviet violation, you can go to war. Hopefully we won't do that. And I don't think anybody proposes that war be the solution to Soviet cheating. However, it was Nazi cheating and Japanese cheating on the naval agreements of the 1930s that directly led to World War II, which cost 40 million lives and almost caused the conquering of Europe by the Nazis. So they're bearing in mind that the ultimate sanction in international politics is war and force. There are other ways we can try to bring the Soviets back into compliance before we have to resort to force. Among them are private diplomatic contacts and public accusations. I'm going to go through the compliance situation with you because it is of great interest in Washington and around the world in these past few weeks and in the weeks to come. The President himself has accused the Soviets of violating 5 arms control agreements: the SALT II Treaty, the Threshold Test Ban Treaty, the Biological Warfare Convention, the Chemical Warfare Convention, and the Kennedy-Khrushchev Agreement of 1962. I'll go into those statements, if you like, in the question period. I'm going to go through these compliance problems in order of conclusivity of the evidence of Soviet cheating, and then draw some conclusions. The Threshold Test Ban limits underground nuclear weapons tests by the Soviet Union, the United States, to the threshold of 150 kilotons. No larger than that size of a weapon can be exploded underground. Now, since 1976, when that threshold went into effect, the whole treaty remains unratified on both the U.S. and Soviet sides, but both sides agreed in 1976 to put that threshold limit into effect, pending ratification. Since 1976, there have been 15 Soviet tests believed to be above 150 kilotons. We have 95% confidence that several of those tests were not only above 150 kilotons, but were at militarily significant levels, that is, above 250 kilotons. And 2 of those tests, 2 of those 15, the lowest possible yield that we can estimate is above 150 kilotons. That's pretty hard evidence. There's strong agreement within the U.S. government, not quite unanimous yet, but strong agreement, that indeed we can say the Soviets are cheating and violating the Threshold Test Ban Treaty with 95% confidence. That's pretty good, a mathematical conclusion like that. The Limited Test Ban Treaty was signed in 1963, just after the Cuban Missile Crisis. It prohibited atmospheric nuclear weapons tests. The British and the People's Republic of, the French and the People's Republic of China did not sign it, therefore they're continuing to test in the atmosphere. Since 1963, under the Limited Test Ban Treaty, there have been 30 cases reported of Soviet venting of radioactive debris outside their borders, and that's the essential prohibition in the Limited Test Ban Treaty. So there's strong evidence of Soviet violation of those 2 test bans. The President himself has accused the Soviets in the United Nations about this time last year, in June of '82, and in his State of the Union speech in January of violating the Geneva Protocol on chemical warfare, banning chemical warfare from 1925, and the Biological Warfare Convention of 1975. The Soviets are manufacturing biological warfare toxins at two places in the Soviet Union, Sverdlovsk and Zagorsk, according to open sources. This is all unclassified. There are 8 other suspect production and storage facilities inside the Soviet Union for biological warfare. At the Sverdlovsk facility in April of 1979, just before the SALT II treaty was signed in Vienna, there was a huge explosion, killed over 1,000 people, according to reports that have reached the public, of a biological warfare facility that was manufacturing and storing biological weapons. The Sverdlovsk incident occurred just before SALT II was signed. We didn't really find out about it until about a year later. The Soviets have expanded their biological warfare facilities after 1972, when the Biological Warfare Convention was signed, and after 1975, when it was ratified, not only by them and by us, but by about 30 other countries. So it's clear that the treaty did not mean much to them, because they continued to expand physically their plants. And they have then gone on to employ biological warfare toxins and chemical warfare toxins in both Southeast and Southwest Asia, Kampuchea, Laos, and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, they're using their own forces. Now, it is true that Afghanistan is not a party to the Biological Warfare Convention, but that doesn't really matter. The Soviets themselves, with their own forces, are using both biological and chemical agents against the Afghanistan freedom fighters. It doesn't really matter that Afghanistan is not a party to either of the conventions. So here we have a second case where we have conclusive evidence of Soviet violation of arms control treaties. This is something the President may talk about tomorrow night. If he doesn't, Senator McClure will be talking about this next week. Soviet violations of the Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement. If the Soviets are violating the very agreement that brought the world back from the worst nuclear crisis that it ever faced, think about the implications. Are we now back in a Cuban Missile Crisis situation if the Soviets are violating the agreement that solved the crisis? Many people believe that the threat from Cuba posed by the Soviet Union today is worse than it was in 1962. During the last year, Soviet leaders have threatened to deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba or Central America, not once, not twice, not 3 times, but 4 times. Many of us believe that nuclear weapons, Soviet nuclear weapons, are already in Cuba, and that we probably couldn't tell if they were there or not for sure. The following activities by the Soviet Union are judged to be in violation of the Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement. And by the way, the Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement is not a treaty. It is not one piece of paper. It consists of 3 letters, 2 from Khrushchev to Kennedy and 1 from Kennedy to Khrushchev, dated October 27 and 28, 1962. They can be reduced to 2 paragraphs. Khrushchev pledged to dismantle and remove and send back to the Soviet Union his SS-4, SS-5 medium and intermediate range ballistic missiles and his IL-28 medium bombers. And Kennedy said this was a firm undertaking of both governments that there would be no reintroduction into Cuba of offensive forces, not only missiles and bombers, but Khrushchev defined offensive forces as troops. Okay, since 1962, the Soviets have brought back into Cuba their combat brigade, which was discovered in July of 1979, and I think we all recall that Senator Frank Church was the one who announced the discovery of that Soviet combat brigade. They have sent Gulf and Echo-class submarines to Cuba during the 1970s. These are submarines. It doesn't matter what kind of propulsion they have. These are both submarines that carry long-range nuclear missiles. Whether they're cruise or ballistic doesn't matter. They carry nuclear warheads. Gulf submarines are included, in fact, in SALT I. Echo is not included in SALT I or SALT II, but they're still submarines equipped with long-range nuclear-tipped missiles. In the case of aircraft, since 1978, the Soviets have been sending MiG-23 fighter bombers to Cuba. MiG-23s are identical in outward appearance to MiG-27s, which can carry and deliver nuclear weapons. Even if you had on-site inspection, you couldn't tell whether a MiG-23 was a MiG-27 because it's just internal wiring that distinguishes the two aircraft. There are about 40 MiG-23s in Cuba today that we believe are capable of delivering nuclear weapons. Since 1969, the Soviets began sending Tu-95 Bear bombers to Cuba. Tu-95 Bear bombers were initially of the reconnaissance variant. Even though they had functional bomb bays, we thought it was innocuous enough to allow the reconnaissance variants to fly back and forth from the Soviet Union to Cuba in the decade from 1969. However, just recently, in the last month, the Soviets have sent for the first time Tu-95 Bear F anti-submarine warfare bombers to Cuba, and these bombers have bomb bays. There's no dispute about that whatsoever. They have bomb bays. So that's a nuclear weapons delivery capability. They have a military communications and intercept station in Cuba, which is not really militarily threatening. And they're using Cuba as a revolutionary base. As I mentioned at the outset, they have shipped to Cuba 3 times as much military equipment, which would fall under the definition of offensive weapons that are prohibited by the Kennedy-Khrushchev agreement, to Cuba in the last year as in any one year since 1962. So I think it's fair to say that even without the deployment of backfire bombers to Cuba or SS-20s to Cuba, which the Soviets are threatening to do, they've threatened to deploy missiles along our very borders. Even without any additional deployment by the Soviet Union to Cuba, they have got more capable delivery systems in Cuba today, and more of them than they had in 1962. They've got 50 of these. They've got about 10 total submarine ballistic missiles here. That's 60. And at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, they had 42 missiles, and they had about 10 bombers. That's 60 now and 50 then. And as I say, we do not have the capability to detect whether or not they have nuclear warheads present in Cuba. We have to assume they may be there. So the delivery capability is already in Cuba, and it's greater than it was in 1962. Now I'm going to stop here in a second. I'm not going to cover everything on this chart. This is SALT II violations. I mentioned earlier in my talk the Plesetsk 4 and the Plesetsk 5. These are 2 new ICBMs that the Soviets are flight testing. The Plesetsk 4 is the size of the MX missile. It was first flight tested last October the 26th. The Plesetsk 5 is the size of our Minuteman missile. It's very small. It was first flight tested on the 8th of February. Now, the SALT II Treaty in Article 4, Paragraph 9, says that neither side can flight test more than 1 new type ICBM. Now, the SALT II Treaty was never ratified by the President on the advice and consent of the Senate. But both the Carter administration and the Reagan administration have pledged to comply with the SALT II Treaty, even though it was unratified, as long as the Soviets complied also. That is, we would do nothing to undercut SALT II as long as the Soviets showed equal restraint. Soviets also pledged to abide by and comply with SALT II, if we did. However, these tests of these 2 new missiles, the PL-4 and the PL-5, strike at the very core provision of the SALT II Treaty. That's Article 4, Paragraph 9, which limits each side to only 1 new type ICBM. Now, there is a dispute in some parts of the government about how to interpret that provision, Article 4, Paragraph 9, and there's an enormous dispute about how to interpret the intelligence evidence concerning these 2 new ICBMs being flight tested on the Soviet side. However, what is not in dispute is the fact that the U.S. government, the President and the Congress, have already interpreted Article 4, Paragraph 9 in such a way that the United States cannot even flight test the MX or develop a new small ICBM in addition, as the Scowcroft Commission recommended 2 weeks ago. That is, the Hart Amendment to the continuing resolution for continuing appropriations this fiscal year, 1983, that was passed last December, states that we will not flight test the MX until Congress agrees on a basing mode for the MX. And the reason that Senator Hart gave on the Senate floor in justification of his Hart Amendment to the Senate was that the United States should not flight test the MX if we were still considering a second new missile, such as a new small missile, because that would violate SALT II, Article 4, Paragraph 9. So we are being constrained by SALT II from even flight testing the MX and simultaneously developing a new small missile, while the Soviets are doing precisely what we're prohibited from doing by our interpretation of SALT II, as agreed to by the Congress and the President, because the President signed the continuing resolution. Now, then all you have to determine is the PL-5 a second new type ICBM? I won't go into the details of the publicly known intelligence on the PL-5, but in the opinion of many senators, it's an open and shut case that the PL-5 is a second new type ICBM. Now, once the President himself, who has already accused the Soviets of violating SALT II on this point, once he can bring the rest of his government into agreement with him and with the senators who already believe this, there will be an enormous implication from Soviet violation of SALT II. It will not be the end of the arms control process. No one is advocating that at all. However, it will require the United States to be more insistent not only on Soviet compliance with existing arms control agreements, but on tighter provisions in any START or INF agreement that we may be able to negotiate with them. We've got to be extremely careful that we tighten everything up so that we can detect and enforce Soviet compliance. I won't go through the other examples on this chart of Soviet SALT II violations, but as you can see, there's a very long list of SALT II violations beyond just the new types. This is SALT I. I won't go through this either. These are the main SALT I interim agreement violations. I mentioned the SS-19 heavy ICBM replacing the light ICBMs in violation of Article 2 of SALT I. This is the ABM treaty, SALT I ABM treaty that Senator Sims has written a letter to the President on concerning Soviet violations. I won't go through that again. I've mentioned all of the SAMs. In conclusion, I would like to say regarding the nuclear weapons freeze, a final set of factors that should warn us against the nuclear weapons freeze. We've had 7 nuclear freezes already with the Soviet Union, and all of them have failed. In 1958, the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreed to a moratorium on atmospheric nuclear weapons testing. The Soviets broke out of that moratorium very dramatically in 1961 with a very provocative series of atmospheric tests. In 1964, the United States unilaterally stopped the production of enriched uranium for weapons production and reduced the number of reactors in our weapons production program from 14 in 1964 down to only 4 today, hoping for Soviet reciprocity in nuclear weapons production. Soviets have increased the number of reactors and warheads in their inventory since 1964. That's freeze number 2 that's failed. In 1967, the United States unilaterally leveled off its ICBMs and SLBM deployment in hopes that the Soviets would reciprocate. Instead, the Soviets kept right on building past those U.S. levels that have been frozen since 1967, and which even now the U.S. is reducing. So that's freeze number 3 that has failed. SALT I in 1972 was portrayed to the Congress and the American people as a freeze on U.S. and Soviet weapons deployments. However, SALT I did not freeze Soviet deployments. They added 1,000 missiles to their force during SALT I. 1977, President Carter canceled the B-1 bomber, hoping that the Soviets would reciprocate with some sign of restraint. They did not. In 1978, President Carter canceled the enhanced radiation warhead, the so-called neutron bomb, in hopes that the Soviets would show some reciprocity. They did not. And then in March of 1982, last year, the late Soviet President Brezhnev proposed a freeze on SS-20 deployment. However, 3 months later, the State Department noticed that they had kept right on building SS-20s. So the Brezhnev unilateral freeze on SS-20 deployment also was violated. There have been 7 nuclear weapons freezes already tried with the Soviet Union, and they've all been violated by the Soviets. We asked the Soviets in Geneva about this. Senator Tower asked Soviet negotiator Dr. Stukin, who was a defense scientist, why they don't show reciprocity to our efforts at unilateral restraint. And Mr. Stukin answered Senator Tower back by saying, "You misunderstand us Russians. We are neither philanthropists nor pacifists." The Soviets think we're crazy if we unilaterally stop our programs hoping that they will follow suit. They believe in horse trading. They're rug merchants. They want to have something. They want to have a quid pro quo. They'll deal with us on that basis, but they just are completely unable to understand our unilateral restraint. At this point, I would like to stop. I've probably talked too long, and open it up for questions. Thank you for your patience and your attention. Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, I want to thank you for coming this afternoon to the panel following this morning's speech. And a couple of corrections. First of all, it's obvious that I'm not Judy Sildy McLeod. She was scheduled to be your moderator today, and unfortunately she is ill and had to leave campus today, so I will substitute for her today. Before we introduce the panel to you, I would also like to remind you that following this hour-and-a-half discussion, which we want you to be very much a